Thank you. Thanks. Thank you to Reed, San Diego, and to all of you for the work you're doing. I'm very excited to be here. I am, in fact, thrilled and honored. Let's see if I can make it do it. Yes. Yes. I am thrilled and honored to be here because, to me, reading and writing are so profoundly powerful. I know I'm speaking to the converted about this. So what I'm here to do is to help in some small way to support you in your work. And what I'm going to do is to give some context for using MI. Why does it make sense to use the theory of multiple intelligences, which I'll just generally shorthand as MI. I'll introduce the theory, talk a little bit about where it came from, and I'll give some examples, small examples of how MI might be used in your volunteer work. And I want to recommend to you, and you can get it on Amazon, Multiple Intelligences and Adult Literacy, which was written by a colleague of mine, Julie Viennes at Harvard Project Zero, with Celia Kallenbach. So they have lots of good examples. I'm not repeating those examples, but you can find lots of good examples, both for adult learners of basic ed and also ESL adults. Okay. This is what I do with my classes. I throw up a graph and say, what do you see? So what do you see here? 90 million adults in the United States, according to a recent report by the National Academy of Sciences, the National Research Council, lack the literacy skills needed for everyday activities in order to have adequate jobs and fulfilling lives in our society. So the work that you're doing as tutors is really helping to meet one of our nation's most profound educational and, I would say, social challenges, right? So this is important work that you're doing. We all know that adults with literacy needs are very diverse. They're diverse in their language background, they're diverse in their experience with decoding, they differ in whether or not they've left school early, whether or not they have learning challenges that were undiagnosed or diagnosed but not adequately addressed. So they're very diverse. They're diverse as well with regard to culture, life experiences, work, motivation to study, income, and approaches to problem solving. This diversity, I think, creates widely variable needs and widely variable opportunities to read in English. So you're all wondering why I have a corset up there, right? You're not listening to any of this because you're thinking about that corset. What is that corset doing there? That corset is a metaphor for how I think about school, because I would argue that this kind of diversity is the norm, and that school, which is a mass institution designed to, kind of batch process people, wants us to be homogenized so that we can be dealt with more efficiently. And so it focuses on a limited array of problem solving. So just as a corset squeezes bodies into this exaggerated shape that's come to be seen as desirable, public schools want to mold minds into a given shape, and they value that shape. And that shape doesn't really take into account our mental proclivities. So students whose minds don't fall into or can't readily be molded into the desired shape can be marginalized or become disengaged. And disengagement is deadly for literacy, which requires sustained motivation, sustained effort, and sustained support. So in reality, human minds, like human bodies, don't have one beautiful form. Therefore, it's not going to be the case that there's only one right way to engage diverse learners, motivate them for the sustained effort that literacy in English requires, or to be supportive of them. MI is a theory that recognizes the range of diversity that humans bring to their learning process, and that all humans with intact minds possess. And once we come to understand the theory, we have a bigger palette of possibilities to help the adults that we work with to grapple with things like decoding, vocabulary, grammar, structure, fluency, comprehension, reading, writing, and doing that in both traditional and digital media, which the National Academy of Sciences is increasingly underscoring as a kind of new literacy. So what does using MI with adult learners do? According to my friend Julie Viennes, again, buy it on Amazon, it can be useful to engage learners in activities that they find meaningful. It also helps in enhancing learners' own views of themselves as learners, which is important to actual learning, right? To see yourself as a learner is sort of the precursor of actual learning. I'm going to ask you to do something at your table. So take a look at this real-world problem. Because it's in the real world that we see the diversity of intelligences taking hold. So let me read this aloud. You're running a bit behind to get to your tutoring session at 9 a.m. Not a biggie. The session at the library is only 2 miles away, heading outbound against the traffic. You did want to stop for some coffee, though. You hustle to your car and, oops, you see you've got a flat tire. You grab for your cell and, oops, again, the battery's dead. Right? This is not an uncommon, totally uncommon scenario. So how do you handle this situation? Take 3 minutes at your table and talk about what do you do to solve this problem or tackle this problem. So you can see that there are an abundant way of solving this problem, and you've solved it in lots of different ways, and you've thought about it in lots of different ways. One of the things I didn't hear is nobody did just that. They didn't go into their glove box, open up the manual and see, how do I change a tire? And can I change a tire in 10 minutes? Nobody did that. And that is the correct answer in school. That's the correct answer in school, right? Read the directions and follow the directions, and you solve your problems. But life, our cognitive life, is much richer than that, and you answered this in a whole lot of different ways. And that included spatial, like what's the distance between me and the student I'm working with, or my tutor, right? We don't know which. Some people called a neighbor, relied on other people. Some people checked in with myself. Maybe I need to go back to bed today. This is just going to be a loser of a day. So what we see is a range of different attacks on a real-world problem. And this tells us that we have a range of ways to solve problems that schools don't tap into. And what Gardner's theory is a way of understanding intelligence more broadly than the traditional approach to intelligence. The traditional approach to intelligence tells us that there's one overarching intelligence called general intelligence. And you can think about it as a thing that's measured by IQ tests. And once you have that, you can line up people from stupidest to smartest, and we're all done. We don't need to know anything else about you, right? And for many years, that's how, through the 30s, 40s, 50s, parts of the 60s, a lot of schools were run that way. You took an IQ test, you were slotted to a particular curriculum, and on you went into your destination in life. So Gardner's theory takes issue with that. And he finds that there are multiple different ways that people problem solve. And he doesn't come to this theory by way of the car problem. He's actually a researcher with good evidence from multiple sources. I don't want to spend too much time on these sources, but I have highlighted the top 4, and I'll talk about 1 or 2 of them. Basically, if G were correct, that there was one general intelligence is also called G, if there were one intelligence, general intelligence, what we would see when somebody suffered a stroke or somebody had a traumatic brain injury is that they would lose everything at the same degree. But that's not what we've seen when we look at people who have suffered these kinds of injuries. So if we look at a stroke patient, we can often see that they have maybe lost their speech or maybe lost their motoric function, but they can still understand words spoken to them. They can still map. They can still engage in a musical activity. So there's a selective sparing. We see the same thing with autistic or other special populations. Sometimes they're great at music, not so great at people, not so great at speech. That's very much in contrast to what G tells us. And then finally, this distinct developmental pathways. What we see when we look at kids is that things develop at different rates. So math develops more slowly than language, right? Language is this miraculous thing. You surround a kid with language, and age 3, they're telling you jokes. It's really quite amazing. At age 3, they are not doing algebra just because you're doing algebra, right? So Gardner uses that evidence to establish several different intelligences, and he defines an intelligence in the way that you see here, a psychobiological potential that can be activated in a cultural setting to solve problems or create products that are that are of value in a culture. So this is a really comprehensive kind of definition, because it's not nature, and it's not nurture, and it's not all about what you're surrounded with. It's all of those things. So nature, nurture, and culture all matter in this definition. And one of the examples that I like to think about is if you were in the Pacific on some island, if you were a resident of a Pacific island 150 years ago, it would make no sense to start reading, right? What would you do with that? Yeah, it's pretty weird, right? You would want to learn to fish and sail and do the things that mattered in your culture. And so one of the challenges we have in teaching kids is sometimes the salience of literacy hasn't been brought home. Once you get the salience of it, it's a darn exciting thing to do, but it has to be made salient. So when we look at linguistic intelligence, it involves sensitivity to language in spoken and written form, the ability to learn languages, and to use language in pursuit of your goals, right? So we all use language, whether we're literate or not, and we can make use of language in various ways, persuading people, selling things to people, bargaining with people, but we see it exemplified in people who are poets, like Maya Angelou depicted there, or journalists, linguists, teachers. Logical mathematical intelligence. This intelligence is usually associated with people like scientists and mathematicians, but it's used in everyday kind of problem solving when we engage in the kind of if-then thinking. You know, if my car is broken, then I can call my neighbor. If my neighbor isn't home, then I can plug in my cell phone. If my cell phone's still dead, I can go to my landline. So that's a kind of logical mathematical intelligence. And we can see it, clearly in people who work on cars. If the battery isn't turning over, is the cable disconnected, is the battery dead, et cetera, and so on. Okay, spatial intelligence. We see this in everyday life in a multitude of ways. Every time we look at our GPS system, we're using this. We use it to locate ourselves in space, to create web pages, to create visual arts. This is a very important human. We use this when we're looking at maps, right, trying to figure out the distance between these two people. This is an intelligence that we rarely see used in schools, although it's being used a little bit more thanks to the web and to web design. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence entails using all or parts of our bodies to solve problems or create products. And this is certainly an intelligence that you cannot exercise generally in school, because that's called bad behavior, right? You don't touch anybody, you don't wiggle in your seat. This is kind of confined to gym class, right, or after school activities. But the way actually we're wired to our strong bands of neural networks are between our frontal lobes and planning, and between our motor cortex. They run right across the top of our heads together. So clearly, before we were all sitting in rows in schools, we were doing things with our bodies in sequential fashion. Okay, musical intelligence. It's like bodily and kinesthetic intelligence in that it's also usually stuck inside of a single class or an after-school activity, but we use it in all kinds of ways, right? It's in our environment. It moves us in the movies. We might write music. We might write music for video games. We use it in religious observations and in performances that we enjoy listening to. So it's all around us, and it's a really interesting subject of study. If you take a look at Oliver Sacks's book, Musicophilia, highly recommended, which delves into enormous capacity for using and appreciating music. Intrapersonal intelligence allows individuals to understand themselves and to use this understanding to know whether or not it's best to go back to bed that day. It also helps us to understand and appreciate our own strengths and how we can harness these in pursuit of our goals or to create something that we value. Intrapersonal intelligence is a little hard to exemplify, right? We'd see it in people who do yoga, meditation. We also see it in certain kinds of writers like Maya Angelou. I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Autobiography draws on this. Interpersonal intelligence. This entails recognizing and making distinctions among others' feelings and intentions every time we work in a team. And every time actually we work with another individual, we are exercising interpersonal intelligence. And we see this as a kind of essential ingredient of leadership. Good, bad, or indifferent, right? So good leaders are using this, bad leaders are using this. It's motivating other people to solve our problems or do work that we want them to do. This was the original set of 7 intelligences, but a few years after Gardner put out the theory in 1983, he realized that the full set of intelligences that would allow us to explain the range of adult occupations and tasks was not complete, right? Sometimes there's a joke about psychologists that they like to put into their theories what they're good at and leave out what they're bad at. So the Naturalist Intelligence, you will never find Howard outside gardening. You won't. He has been made to walk his dog. But really, more than 90% of Americans were engaged in agriculture till about 150 years ago. Much of the world still is very strongly attached to working the land or working the sea or understanding how to use components of the natural world to solve problems or fashion products. We see it in the modern day world in everything from epigenetics to medicine. To gardening, to florists, to cooks who are really good at understanding the ingredients that they're working with. So those are the 8 intelligences. Gardner's not wedded to 8. If he could argue for a 9th based on those criteria, he would have more, but these, you know, he's kind of parsimonious. There have been candidates that he's rejected, like spiritual intelligence. You were thinking of that? Yeah. In our real-world lives, we use intelligences in various combinations to solve problems. It's hardly ever the case that a single intelligence does the trick. So even if I'm, in a past life, I was a musician, even as a musician, I wasn't only relying on musical intelligence. I was relying on interpersonal intelligence to connect with an audience. When I was singing, I was making sense of the lyrics in different languages and trying to understand their meaning and how best to express them. I was using bodily kinesthetic intelligence, controlling breath, and so forth. So all real-world tasks, just about all of them that I can think of, maybe you'll come up with an exception, rely on combinations. All normal people have all 8 intelligences. One of the troubling uses of the theory is when I've gone into schools and here, that's my bodily kinesthetic, which is, this kid can't stay still. No, that child has all the intelligences unless brain damaged, and we need to figure out how to use the bodily kinesthetic in service of problem solving. And then finally, profiles of intelligence vary. So 2 people with the same IQs can have very different intelligences, and usually I'll put up a slide of me and my ex-husband, but I didn't do that today. So how might we use the theory of multiple intelligences with adult learners who have struggled in school, who may have low self-concept, who may not understand the range of potentials that they bring to a learning environment? It can be very helpful to wave out this Harvard guy with a MacArthur Prize who says, yes, even you have a range of strengths that school has not recognized necessarily. So it can be very helpful. And it can be helpful to run through activities with them in conversation to say, what do you like to do? What do you enjoy doing? What do you feel you're good at? So that we build up a sense in their own lives that they have a range of intelligences. You can also have them reflect on their strengths. You can have them go into one-on-one sessions to talk with you or talk with a classmate, another member of the literacy learning group, to say what do they do well, what might they do well, how could they tackle problems that they weren't necessarily tackling in a traditional way. So I want to talk with you to get a little clearer using a couple of examples. And then, just by way of previewing, which is good pedagogy, I'm going to ask you to come up with an example at your table, okay? So one of the things that we know is that using activities that are real world helps to engage learners and keep them motivated. So in this simulation, what we're asking, potentially asking learners to do is to dig out job applications. You can bring those to the class. And look at the range of skills that go into any particular job, right? So if you're a staff assistant or if you're a gardening assistant, think about what are the range of intelligences that go into that job. The materials for this are very flexible. You don't have to have a lot of money. You don't have to have a lot of prowess. You can use the internet and show different job ads. You can ask people to bring in the job ads. And this gives learners an opportunity to think about their strengths, to gain vocabulary, practice decoding. And one of the things that I've seen done with younger kids is that they develop, or younger learners, is that they develop a little tiny resume. And they practice giving a little tiny job talk with PowerPoints. So it's quite adorable. I mean, with the little kids, they come in ties. Yeah, and they've practiced. And the beauty of that practice is it gives them fluency in speech, and they can sort of start to translate that into more fluent reading and writing. Another activity which I'm really hopeful about, and I would love to know if people have tried this, is a simulation of the Parent-Teacher Conference. A lot of people come from cultures where you don't question the teacher. You don't know what to ask of the teacher. There's a project that's been going on in Cambridge, Massachusetts called the Right Project, the Right Question Project. One piece of that is to help people to understand what questions you might ask in different kinds of civic activities, including a parent-teacher conference. So you can have students practice asking questions that they might want to know about what's going on in the classroom, practice writing those questions down, practice reading those questions to each other. There are all kinds of good videos about parent-teacher conferences, what not to do for the teachers, what you should not do as a teacher at a parent-teacher conference. And what we know from research is that parent engagement in their children's literacy activities and their children's schooling is an enormous predictor of those children's success. The parents themselves don't have to be highly literate in English, but they have to engage with the school. So this is kind of helping two generations at once, if you can try this out. Okay, this is an activity that might work for younger adults, so people who might have dropped out of school, people who are visually oriented, which is to have them make an illustration or make a cartoon or make a comic strip, or they could make a poster that potentially represents a place that they like to go, obviously drawing on spatial intelligence, drawing on linguistic intelligence, and then have them narrate what goes on. So one of the other things we know from cognitive science is that story is the privileged channel to learning, right? Stories are it. If you can put it in story form, people will generally learn it. So having them string together vocabulary into story form will help them to learn vocabulary, will help them to practice that vocabulary because it's coherent. So these are three ideas I wanted to share. Take 5 minutes to map out a little activity using multiple intelligences, interpersonal, spatial, logical, mathematical, naturalist, what have you. What does the activity look like? That's one piece. What intelligences does it draw on? And then try and make it as authentic as possible, as real as possible, because that builds engagement and motivation with the activity. So take 5 and we'll share for 3.
The student has to describe or draw. The main thing is it's got an introduction and an ending and a body. You don't have to do.
You know, the knowledge that was marginalized maybe in school or never developed in school, but now we can see is really powerful. So, and I have goosebumps. This was unbelievable. I want you to keep perspective. MI is one tool among many. It's not going to work for every learner. It's not going to work in all cases. I just want you to add it, you know, like another arrow in your quiver if it makes sense and when it makes sense to use it. Because given the diversity of people in that 90 million adult learners category, you need a lot of tools and you need a lot of persistence, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. So sharing this theory is one thing to do if it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, don't do it, but you can keep it for yourself as a way to expand your understanding of learners. If you teach it to your students, they will have an expanded understanding. Not every student will want to know or care, but some will, and it's been helpful. So finally, I'm going to do it. Yes, thank you very much.